Somewhere in the Omani desert, 1972, a Dhofari rebel fighter crests a ridge and looks down into a valley. He sees nothing. The rocks are a dusty pink-red, the sand is pale, the heat shimmer distorts everything beyond 50 meters. He looks again. Still nothing. He begins to move. 40 meters below him, 3 men in a Land Rover with no doors, no roof, and no windscreen are watching him through binoculars. The Land Rover is painted pink. It has been there for 2 hours. The rebel has walked past it twice. The crew waits until he is close enough that missing is not an option. They are SAS. The vehicle is called the Pink Panther. It is about to ruin his day. The Land Rover Series IIA that the SAS converted into its primary desert warfare vehicle from 1968 to 1984 was not, by any conventional military measure, impressive. It had no armor. It had no protection. Its doors had been removed. Its windscreen had been removed. Its roof had been removed. Fully loaded with weapons, fuel, water, ammunition, and equipment, it weighed 3 tons. A heavy machine gun round would pass straight through it. An RPG would end the conversation permanently. It looked ridiculous. It looked like a pink farm truck that had been assaulted by a military surplus store, and it was, without question, the most effective long-range desert warfare vehicle ever built by any army in the Cold War. The SAS used it to fight across Oman, Yemen, Jordan, Kenya, Belize, and the German border. When they finally retired it in 1984, they replaced it with a bigger Land Rover. When that one retired, they replaced it with another Land Rover. The British Army used Land Rovers in the Special Forces role for over 50 years. The Pink Panther was where that half-century began. To understand why the Pink Panther existed, you need to understand what the SAS had been doing since 1941. David Stirling founded the regiment in the western desert of North Africa with a simple and devastating idea. Small teams of men, moving fast in armed vehicles, could reach targets that conventional military operations could not touch. The long-range desert group provided transport. The targets were German airfields, supply lines, communications. The vehicles were American Willys Jeeps, festooned with twin Vickers K machine guns, carrying enough fuel and water and food for a week behind enemy lines. At its peak, the SAS was destroying more Axis aircraft on the ground than the Royal Air Force was destroying in the air. The principle was mobility, surprise, and firepower concentrated at the moment of choice. By the time the regiment reformed in the 1950s and began operating in Oman, the Jeep had been replaced by the Land Rover, Britain's own utilitarian masterpiece, but the doctrine was unchanged. Small teams, long range, maximum violence at the point of contact, and then gone before anyone could respond. The Series I Land Rovers used in Oman in the late 1950s were 88 inches long and already proving too small. By 1967, the SAS needed something that could carry more fuel, more water, more weapons, and more men across longer distances in harsher terrain. The answer was the Land Rover Series I Series IIA 109 inches of wheelbase, long enough to carry everything the mission demanded. The Ministry of Defense bought 72 of them in 1968 and sent them to Marshals of Cambridge, a specialist military vehicle conversion firm, for transformation. What came back from Cambridge bore almost no relationship to what had been delivered. The doors were gone, the windscreen was gone, the roof was gone. The standard fuel tank had been replaced by 4 tanks with a combined capacity of 100 gallons, enough for a range of over 1,000 miles with jerrycans. Water reservoirs were added, oil reservoirs were added, the chassis was strengthened, the suspension was upgraded for dune bashing, sand tires were fitted. A spare tire was mounted on the front rather than the bonnet, so that if the vehicle hit something at speed in the dark, the spare would take the impact before the engine did. Sand ladders were bolted to the sides, metal sheets with holes cut out that could be slid under a bogged wheel to provide traction and allow the vehicle to drive itself free from the deep sand that stopped everything else. Smoke grenade launchers front and rear, axle guards, navigation sun compass, searchlights, blackout lamps, signal equipment, jerry cans of every fluid the crew might need, arranged with obsessive precision for weight distribution across the axles. The weapon fit was lavish by any standard. The commander, who also navigated, had twin 7.62mm general-purpose machine guns on a forward-facing pad above the dashboard. Behind him, the radio operator faced rearward with either twin GPMGs or a Browning 50 caliber heavy machine gun. The crew carried Carl Gustav 84mm recoilless rifles, L.W. Usher 66mm disposable anti-tank rockets, grenade launchers, and their personal weapons. Fully loaded, the vehicle weighed nearly 3 tons. It could reach 80 miles per hour on road. In the desert, it could go anywhere the sand wasn't too deep to drive through, and the sand ladders dealt with the places that were. The color was the last decision and the strangest. The vehicles left marshals painted bronze green, standard British military color, designed for European fields and hedgerows. Green in a desert is not camouflage. Green in a desert is a target. The SAS had been looking for an alternative since the long-range desert group had operated in North Africa in the Second World War, and the answer they eventually settled on was so counterintuitive that new recruits refused to believe it until they saw it work. Pink. The origin story has several versions, all pointing to the same discovery. An aircraft had been painted pink. Some accounts say for high visibility to make it easy to find if it crashed. Others say the metal had simply oxidized to pink after years in the desert sun. When the aircraft did crash, the search party spent days failing to find it. The pink metal had blended into the desert so completely that trained searchers, looking directly at it, could not see it. The SAS tested the principle on their vehicles. SAS veteran Colin Armstrong described standing next to a Pink Panther in the desert and thinking it couldn't possibly work until he saw it at distance, where it vanished completely into the rocks of Oman and Yemen, where the geology runs to pinky red. The tires were painted pink. The jerrycans were painted pink. Everything that could carry a color was pink. The vehicle that had been bronze green left for the desert looking, as one veteran put it, like something from a children's cartoon. It disappeared into the landscape as if it had never been there. The Pink Panther served the SAS from 1968 to 1984 in every theater where Britain's special forces operated. Oman was the primary deployment, the Dhofar campaign against Soviet and Chinese-backed rebels who had nearly overrun the Sultan's forces before the SAS arrived to turn the war around. The Pinkies operated in Dhofar through the heat of the conflict, long-range patrols pushing deep into rebel territory, the crews sleeping under the vehicles at night, surviving on the rations and water they carried because there was nowhere to resupply for days at a stretch. In Jordan, the vehicles trained Jordanian special forces in long-range desert operations. In Kenya, in Belize, in the terrain between the inner German border where olive-drab Pinkies listened for Warsaw Pact movement, the vehicle adapted to every environment its crews were sent to. The weapons fit evolved as technology evolved. The Vickers K guns of the early deployments gave way to the GPMG. The GPMG was supplemented by the Browning .50 caliber. Milan anti-tank missiles appeared on some vehicles as the threat environment changed, and heavier firepower became available in a package small enough to carry on a Land Rover. The vehicle itself never fundamentally changed. It was a Land Rover Series IIA, with the unnecessary bits removed and the essential bits multiplied. Its simplicity was its strength. Any SAS trooper could fix any fault with tools carried on the vehicle. Any fault that couldn't be fixed with onboard tools was a vehicle that got abandoned and a crew that walked. The Pinkies never broke down in ways that couldn't be fixed. They broke half-shafts constantly, a known weakness of the Series IIA under sustained heavy use. But a half-shaft could be replaced in the desert in under an hour by a man with the right training and the right tools, both of which every crew member had. The replacement arrived in 1985. The Land Rover Defender 110, converted by Glover Webb of Hamble for SA service, carried the same doctrine into a newer chassis with coil spring suspension instead of the leaf springs that had been upgraded but never quite right on the IIA. The new vehicle was faster, more comfortable, and capable of carrying heavier loads. It was painted sand and dark blue rather than pink, though veterans still called it a pinky by force of habit. It was these Defender 110s that A and D Squadrons drove into Iraq in January 1991 during the Gulf War, operating in half-squadron formations against Scud missile launchers in the western Iraqi desert. SAS veteran Peter Ratcliffe later described it as the biggest gathering of SAS personnel in a battle zone anywhere in the world since the end of the Second World War. The Land Rover columns were resupplied by RAF Chinooks as they pushed deeper into Iraq, hunting launcher vehicles on roads the coalition air forces couldn't see at night. The squadrons were told to slow down because they were destroying too much too fast. When B Squadron was sent in on foot for the Bravo 20 operation, the ill-fated patrol that left its vehicles behind and paid a catastrophic price, the contrast with the vehicle-mounted squadrons who operated successfully throughout the war was not lost on anyone who studied the campaign afterwards. The men in the Land Rovers came home. The men on foot did not all do so. Of the original 72 Pink Panthers built by Marshals of Cambridge in 1968, approximately 20 are believed to survive. They are among the most sought-after military Land Rovers ever produced. When one comes to sale, the price reflects not just the vehicle, but the history attached to it. At a Bonhams auction in 2019, an authenticated 1968 Series 112 Pink Panther that had served in Oman, Jordan, Kenya, and Belize sold for £47,000. The Dunsfold collection holds examples. The Land Rover Heritage Collection displays one. The British Army used Land Rovers in the Special Forces role from the late 1950s until 2014, when the vehicle was finally retired after 5 decades. In that time, the British military consumed approximately 200,000 Land Rovers. Of all of them, the Pink Panther is the one that became an icon. It became an icon for the most irrational and most logical of reasons simultaneously. It was painted a color that looked wrong in every context except the one that mattered. In the desert, at distance, in the heat shimmer, the vehicle that should have been the most visible thing on the ground became invisible. The SAS had taken Britain's most ubiquitous utility vehicle, stripped it to its bones, loaded it with enough firepower to engage anything it found, painted it a color that made sensible men laugh, and created the desert warfare platform that every special forces unit in the world would spend the next 50 years trying to imitate. They never quite managed it, because the Pink Panther's secret was never the vehicle, it was the men inside it, and those you cannot copy.